De Niro's been at the center of some of the most important movies ever made, so if anyone probably has the best opinion on the movies, it's De Niro. And lucky for us, we know what movies he considers the best of the best. De Niro has talked about his favorites over the years, and these aren't just good films, they're essential. So let's get into it. These are 8 classic films Robert De Niro wants you to see. De Niro has always had an appreciation for British cinema, and this film was one of his earliest influences. Back in 1994, during an interview with Kenneth Branagh, De Niro mentioned Saturday Night and Sunday Morning as one of the films that stuck with him. This one is a defining film of the British New Wave. It follows Arthur, a rebellious young machinist who spends his weekends drinking, partying, and having an affair with a married woman. It's one of those working-class dramas that captures the frustration of an entire generation, especially through its angry young man protagonist. Albert Finney's performance as Arthur was a game-changer. Malcolm McDowell even credited this movie as the reason he wanted to become an actor. And it wasn't just actors who took notice. Ian Fleming saw the film, and right after that, he sold the rights to James Bond to producer Harry Saltzman, leading to the Bond franchise as we know it. Critics and audiences recognized its impact immediately. The film won 3 BAFTAs and decades later was ranked 14th on the British Film Institute's list of the greatest British films of all time. This one holds a special place for De Niro, especially because of its ending, which he once called incredible. De Niro's been a lifelong fan of Elia Kazan, and that admiration actually goes both ways. Kazan himself once said that out of all the actors he worked with, De Niro was the hardest working of them all. Splendor in the Grass follows 2 high school sweethearts in the 1920s who struggle against the pressures of their families and society, with Natalie Wood and Warren Beatty delivering some of the best performances of their careers. The film won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, and for Beatty, this wasn't just his first big role, it was the start of everything. He saw Kazan as a mentor, learning everything he could about acting, directing, and breaking down a script. Kazan respected Beatty's talent, but wasn't exactly a fan of his attitude. In his autobiography, Kazan wrote that Beatty was a little snotty, but still managed to grow into a formidable man. The film has left a lasting impact, not just on Robert De Niro, but on other legendary filmmakers and actors as well. Jeff Goldblum has called it a personal favorite, and Martin Scorsese once said it was one of the best widescreen films ever made. Brando won his first Oscar for this one. De Niro has called Brando's work in On the Waterfront and A Streetcar Named Desire some of the greatest performances of all time. The I Could Have Been a Contender monologue is of the most quoted moments in cinema, and On the Waterfront left such an impression on De Niro that he personally convinced Scorsese to let him reference it in Raging Bull, recreating Brando's speech for the film's closing scene. But the movie wasn't just a turning point for acting, it was actually deeply personal for its director, Elia Kazan. After testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, Kazan was exiled by Hollywood's left-wing circles. On the Waterfront became his way of justifying his decision, with Brando's character standing up to corruption mirroring Kazan's own stance. And he didn't hide it. Years later, recalling the night the film took home 8 Oscars, Kazan openly admitted, "Every day I worked on that film, I was telling the world where I stood and my critics to go and fuck themselves." James Dean's first major Hollywood role, his first Oscar nomination. And in De Niro's words, a performance so great that no one else could ever do what Dean did in this film. East of Eden adapts the second half of John Steinbeck's novel, ditching the first part entirely because Kazan just didn't like it. The result is a brutally emotional story of family, rejection, and identity, with Dean's character Cal desperately trying to earn his father's approval. De Niro wasn't the only one deeply affected by this movie. Leonardo DiCaprio has called East of Eden the film that made him obsessed with acting. He's talked about watching it 5 times in a row. His desperation to be loved. That performance just broke my heart. Even Scorsese has praised Kazan's work on the film, saying that when you watch East of Eden on the big screen, it looks like photographs from the period. He compared it to The Americans, the legendary photo book by Robert Frank, because of how perfectly it captures Americana. If East of Eden introduced James Dean as an actor, Rebel Without a Cause turned him into a legend. It was the defining movie of teenage angst, a film that spoke directly to a generation of young people who had never seen themselves on screen before. What's interesting is that Warner Brothers almost didn't make this movie. They actually bought the rights to the original book in 1947 and even tested Marlon Brando for the lead. But the project got scrapped. It wasn't until years later, when James Dean was on the rise, that they pulled it off the shelf, rewrote it, and finally made the version we know today. Dean died just weeks before the film's release. He never got to see the cultural explosion it caused. But to this day, Rebel Without a Cause is the movie people think of when they talk about James Dean. His style, his attitude, his performance, it all became iconic. De Niro has talked about a lot of great actors over the years, but there's a core group that always comes up: James Dean, Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift. And A Place in the Sun is the ultimate Montgomery Clift movie. A tragic story about ambition, love, and consequences. Clift plays a poor guy trying to work his way up in high society, but he falls for two women, one played by Shelley Winters and the other by Elizabeth Taylor, who was just 18 at the time and taking on her first real adult role. Taylor was intimidated working with Clift, calling herself a Hollywood puppet next to him, but Clift put her at ease, and they ended up forming a lifelong friendship right there on set. Visually, this one stands out. There's a dark, almost film noir quality to it, but at the same time, it has some of the most passionate and romantic sequences ever filmed. It won 6 Oscars, was a huge critical hit, and when Charlie Chaplin saw it, he called it the greatest movie ever made about America. If there's one thing De Niro loves in a movie, it's great acting, and the treasure of the Sierra Madre is packed with it. Walter Houston, who De Niro thought was fantastic in this, plays a grizzled old prospector guiding 2 out-of-work drifters, played by Humphrey Bogart and Tim Holt. They head into the Sierra Madre Mountains to mine for gold, but greed, paranoia, and straight-up madness start eating away at them. The studio didn't know what to do with this movie. Jack L. Warner, who was running the show, kept pulling the crew out of Mexico whenever the budget got out of hand. But even he had to admit that the finished product was something special. He called it definitely the greatest motion picture we have ever made.